While the eyes of the world have been fixed on events in Russia, to the south, a civil war in Georgia has become increasingly savage.
These fighters belong to the Confederation of Caucasian Mountain Republics, a loose assembly of Muslim people from South Russia.
The Chechens are convinced the Russians are behind Georgia's actions against the Abkhazians, a fellow mountain people.
The number of weapons in Tbilisi has reached lethal proportions. All this is pushing Mr. Shevardnadze into imposing what he calls a special regime.
Georgia, under this fascist rule, is a cancer for the whole Russia.
Hundreds of desperate civilians trying to fight their way on board every plane.
Civil war is always a very dirty, cruel, awful business.
Street fighting in Abkhazia, the former Soviet Union's most recent civil war, and one which this time threatens Russia itself. These Abkhazian forces are fighting tanks sent from Georgia last month to crush independence moves in the region. They're fighting street by street and tree to tree for control of the capital city, Sukhumi. Furthest forward, this unit of irregular forces from South Russia. Nearly 2,000 volunteers from the Russian Caucasus crossed the border to fight on the Abkhazian side. Well armed with weapons bought from the thriving black market of the Caucasus, these fighters belong to the Confederation of Caucasian Mountain Republics, a loose assembly of Muslim people from South Russia. It is their presence here which is causing concern in Moscow that the fighting could break its borders and lead to a full-scale war in the Russian Caucasus. If the fighting spreads from Abkhazia, it could render this entire region ungovernable, depriving Russia of its only remaining link to the Black Sea, its main trading outlet. Concerned about security along its southern border, Russia summoned the parties involved to Moscow for peace talks.
We've been preparing for this meeting for some time, and in spite of the fact that this situation is so tense and dramatic, we've still managed to prepare a document which could in the future become a platform for reconciliation.
To what extent do you think relations between Tbilisi and Moscow have been strained by the fighting in Abkhazia?
We've spent much of today discussing Russian-Georgian relations. Both President Yeltsin and myself agree that we have to try harder to develop a new, stronger relationship. Following the recent events in Abkhazia, we've agreed to draw up a new agreement on our borders.
Do you detect any particular concern from President Yeltsin after talking to him today?
If we do not manage to stop the bloodshed in Abkhazia, it could lead to the Lebanization of the Caucasus region. That's why Boris Yeltsin has been so eager to find a solution to the crisis. Russia itself could be threatened by instability in the Caucasus. It's in the interests of both Georgia and Russia to prevent this conflict in the Caucasus from escalating beyond control and affecting both our nations.
Already thousands of Abkhazians have fled the region, and there have been reports that some Georgian armed gangs are trying to take over Abkhazian towns and villages. Edward Shevardnadze says he is aware that some armed groups are committing atrocities. The fear is that unless he can bring all Georgian forces under his control, the situation in Abkhazia could result in an all-out war in this strategic region. Paul Simpson, ITN, Moscow.
For weeks in autumn, the Caucasus Mountains are blanketed in a thick fog. They form a natural barrier between Georgia and Russia, but as the conflict in Abkhazia has intensified, so guns and fighters from northern Caucasian tribes have crossed the mountains under the cover of the mist to defend the Abkhazian rebels.
Мы по горным тропам, которые знаем только мы, на себе, на лошадях, на мулах переносим оружие. Если мы сегодня перевезли оружие, этим завтра наши ребята там воюют.
There are more than a dozen different peoples living in the northern Caucasus. Although they are part of Russia, they have a tradition of fierce independence and conflict with Moscow, no more so than the Chechens. The gunfire accompanies a Chechen wedding celebration in the village square in Chala in the Caucasian foothills. It's a noisy family affair. Most households in this Muslim community have firearms. The groom, who isn't present at this stage of the ceremony, is the son of one of the village's leading families. His uncle is a businessman based in Moscow who buys and sells anything and everything on the fringes of the law. Dancing over, the groom's family deliver their dowry, a sheep, together with money and clothes. In the eyes of Moscow, the Chechens are the agents provocateurs of the northern Caucasus. Their capital, Grozny, in the shadow of the mountains, is officially under economic blockade by Moscow, as it has become the first part of Russia to declare itself independent, though nobody outside recognizes it as such. To the anger of Russia, it has erected border posts, manned by its own National Guardsmen. More than half the North Caucasian fighters and weapons in Abkhazia are said to come from here. The Chechens are convinced the Russians are behind Georgia's actions against the Abkhazians, a fellow mountain people. And although the Chechen president denies his government is officially involved in recruiting, he sees Chechnya as the champion of the mountain peoples, for whom he has a broader vision.
У нас только одно будущее – объединить Кавказ на конфедеративной основе и дать право любому народу, здесь живущим, самоопределиться. Безотлагательно вывести российские войска с территории Кавказа.
A week ago, Grozny hosted a conference of the Confederation of Caucasian Mountain Peoples. It was a fiery affair. There were calls for unity and bitter condemnation of Moscow. But perhaps most worrying for Russia, there were calls for the rejection of Boris Yeltsin's Federation Treaty, a document seen as crucial to attempts to hold Russia together. 16 groups, mostly northern Caucasian tribes and nationalists, including the Abkhazians, are represented by the Confederation. The convinced Georgian leader Edvard Shevardnadze is working with Russia and receiving Russian weapons.
Но если Россия закроет на это глаза, будет по-прежнему передавать Грузии оружие и помогать грузинской хунте убивать абхазский народ, то я боюсь, что на Кавказе люди поднимутся в первую очередь для освобождения Северного Кавказа от России.
Grozny is a place of contrast. Food is scarce, so's running water. But there is conspicuous wealth, evidence outsiders say of how the city has become the center of organized crime in the former Soviet Union. The Chechens insist they're merely good businessmen, but admit that money for arms has not been hard to raise. And there's another reason for a close interest in Georgian events. One of the city's leading guests is the former Georgian president overthrown in January. As president, he was no friend of separatist movements. Now he thinks President Yeltsin is losing control of the whole area.
Now, Georgia, under this fascist rule, is a cancer for the whole Russia. And it will bring destruction and destabilization to the whole Russia. And it will be danger of war, danger of destabilization. And this destabilization and this war may be soon widespread in the Caucasus.
But he doubts he will return to Tbilisi.
Now it's very hard to say. It's very hard to say, but I am not eager to come back. I want peace, I want understanding between peoples. And I do not want this war, this crazy war.
There is a further twist in the Caucasian conflict. Chechnya is strongly and increasingly Muslim, with new mosques being erected throughout the mountain foothills. The Abkhazians share that faith, and Islam is the motive for many of the volunteer fighters. For Boris Yeltsin, Abkhazia may be an irritant, but its capacity to inflame the northern Caucasus is the real threat to him and the Russian Federation. Ian Williams, ITN, Chechnya.
A fragile ceasefire agreed 3 weeks ago in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia is now in danger following an attack by government troops on 3 rebel villages late last night. Law and order across the country has broken down after a year of fighting between Georgian forces and guerrillas in breakaway Abkhazia. The battle for the capital Sukhumi has left the city without electricity, fuel or water. So far, the war has claimed more than 4,000 lives. The political survival of Georgia's President Eduard Shevardnadze could now depend on his ability to maintain the peace agreement. Paul Simpson reports from Georgia on a conflict which threatens the country's hopes of a democratic future.
Georgian soldiers heading to the breakaway republic of Abkhazia. There, a shaky ceasefire is holding after a year of civil war. But neither the Georgians nor the Abkhazians are taking any chances, and both are keeping their armies up to strength. These men were dispatched to the only remaining Georgian stronghold in Abkhazia, the regional capital, Sukhumi. Sukhumi has been under siege for nearly a year now, surrounded by Abkhazian artillery high up in the mountains. Tank traps and sandbags have been thrown up around town. Much of Sukhumi lies deserted. 3/4 of the civilian population has fled, and now only gunmen roam the ruins. Law and order has collapsed, and large sections of Sukhumi are controlled by armed gangs. We heard accounts of appalling atrocities committed by what the local people described as bandits, accounts of looting, murder and rape. Even the local army commander needs a special bodyguard when traveling around town. I've had to issue an emergency decree to restore order, he said. After a year of heavy shelling, few buildings have been left intact. There's been no water or electricity here for 10 months. Drinking water is collected from 7 kilometers away by the few residents who remain, and they plunder the city's parks for firewood. Along the front line, some people still live in the shells of their houses. This woman's home has been hit several times by mortar fire. She's chosen to stay here to guard her few possessions from the gunmen. Many in the Georgian army oppose the ceasefire. They want to fight on to recapture lost lands, and their anger is directed at the Georgian leader, Eduard Shevardnadze. The greatest threat to the truce comes from the irregular forces. They are so unpredictable that even Georgian soldiers are wary when approaching them. Drawn from the local population, they act independently, ignoring commands from the Georgian army. For them, the ceasefire appears to be merely a chance to keep a watchful eye on the Abkhazian forces only 30 meters away across this dried-up riverbed. This is the front line of the battle for Sukhumi, and it's here that the ceasefire is being most frequently broken. If a lasting truce is to be imposed here, then Eduard Shevardnadze will have to regain full control of these frontline troops. So great is their threat to peace here that Mr. Shevardnadze is planning to use force to disarm them.
და გავაგზავნე აფხაზეთში ძალიან ძლიერი რაზმი, მრავალრიცხოვანი არ არის, მაგრამ ძლიერი რაზმია ის 150 კაცი, რომელმაც უნდა განაიარაღოს ზოგიერთი აი ეს არაფორმალური უკანონო შეერაღებული ფორმირებები.
Those armed units are a threat to Mr. Shevardnadze's position, but there are threats closer to home, on the streets of the capital Tbilisi, from restless soldiers returning fully armed from the Abkhazian battlefields. Barely an hour goes by without the sound of gunfire across town. Roadblocks have been set up to confiscate guns from the soldiers, and already the number of weapons in Tbilisi has reached lethal proportions.
მე ამიტომ ვლაპარაკობ, რომ ჩვენ დაგვჭირდება რაღაც განსაკუთრებულ რეჟიმზე გადასვლა. Როგორი იქნება ეს განსაკუთრებული რეჟიმი, მე ჯერ კიდევ არ დამიმუშავებია. დავამუშავებთ და ალბათ საზოგადოებას შევთავაზებთ განსაკუთრებულ ღონისძიებებს. ეს ყველა ომის შემდეგ იწყება ეს გართულებები, რომელზეც თქვენ ლაპარაკობთ, მათ შორის არც საქართველო იქნება გამონაკლისი, ჩვენ ეს ვიცით.
Mr. Shevardnadze may yet be forced to take even harsher measures to safeguard his rule. In the Georgian parliament, there is no shortage of politicians prepared to harness the anger of returning soldiers and mount a challenge to the government. They share the military's view that the ceasefire is a betrayal. Their battle cry is that Georgia should fight on to reclaim the lands lost in the war.
მე ვიცი რომ ასეთი განწყობილებები არის. არა მარტო ჯარისკაცებში და არა იმდენად ჯარისკაცებში სხვათა შორის. ჯარისკაცებმა იციან რა არის ეს ომი და რამდენი სიცოცხლე შეეწირა მას. უფრო მეტად ეს სირთულეები არის პარლამენტში და საზოგადოების გარკვეულ ნაწილში.
A small advance party of United Nations observers has arrived in Abkhazia. They are preparing for the arrival of a full UN monitoring force. Already they are doubtful the ceasefire arrangements can be fulfilled.
It concerns or revolves around the withdrawal of artillery and heavy equipment and also forces. So they have a plan, but if they will be able to follow that plan, the sides, I doubt it.
The ceasefire has already been broken many times. The war in Abkhazia has almost bankrupted the Georgian economy. Peace here will give Georgia another chance to find political stability. But at present, there seems little chance of that. The men intent on sabotaging the ceasefire will not easily surrender their weapons. Paul Simpson, Channel 4 News, Sukhumi. It was a short, terse statement from Edward Shevardnadze. It's impossible to work with you, he shouted at the deputies. He had asked Parliament to approve a state of emergency and give him special powers to curb the activities of the country's numerous armed groups. But opposition deputies accused him of trying to assume dictatorial powers. Jaba Yosseliani, the leader of one of those armed groups, accused him of behaving like a communist ruler. At that point, Mr. Shevardnadze stormed out, with deputies still shouting after him. He answered back, "I'm fed up, you have my resignation." Then some deputies realized they'd gone too far and tried to stop him from leaving. That failed, and less than an hour later, Parliament voted to reject Shevardnadze's resignation and ask him to return to office. But Mr. Shevardnadze stood firm. Since Shevardnadze returned to his native Georgia 18 months ago, the country has suffered civil war and economic chaos. A year-long war in the Abkhazian region ground to a halt last month, only after Georgia lost most of its lands there. The ceasefire deal signed by Mr. Shevardnadze was opposed by many in the Georgian parliament. Opposition too from Georgian soldiers who saw the ceasefire as a betrayal. Returning fully armed to the capital Tbilisi, they presented a grave threat to Shevardnadze's rule. When we spoke to Mr. Shevardnadze last month, he said he was aware of the many dangers he was facing, and he singled out Parliament for particular criticism.
I am aware of these feelings in the military, but not just in the military. These problems are mainly arising in Parliament. There are some powers that will try to stop us from achieving peace, and I have decided that in order to save our democratic achievements, we will have to resort to stricter measures against those who are guilty, against the destructive elements in our society.
That was the message he took to the Parliament this morning, that unless all the armed gangs were forced to lay down their weapons, Georgia would disintegrate into chaos. Mr. Shevardnadze's threat to resign has caused fear amongst the Georgian people. Many see him as the only person capable of averting all-out civil war. This afternoon, thousands gathered outside the Parliament building to plead with Mr. Shevardnadze to remain in office. He said he would return if Parliament agreed to his demands for a state of emergency and disbands itself for a period of 3 months, leaving him with absolute power in Georgia. Mr. Shevardnadze may still be unable to bring order to the turbulent world of Georgian politics, but without him, Georgia would almost certainly face a period of greater political instability and violence. Paul Simpson, Channel 4 News, Moscow.
The only way into Sukhumi is by air. Virtually the only passengers are Georgian soldiers and their priests, who have volunteered to try and save the city from the Abkhazian rebels besieging it. On the ground, chaos. Hundreds of desperate civilians trying to fight their way on board every plane. Soldiers fire in the air to drive them back. Once Sukhumi was a holiday resort. Today, refugees, smashed buildings and shell fire. The shells are fired by Abkhazian troops, allegedly helped by elements of the Russian army. At least 500 people have died in the indiscriminate bombardment. Leading the fight to hold the city is the Georgian leader Eduard Shevardnadze, known in the West as the former Soviet foreign minister under Gorbachev. With his bodyguards in the outer office, Shevardnadze has come close to death several times when shells hit the building.
It is very dangerous because the enemy is coming into the city. The people are fighting, but there is panic.
Next morning, one of Shevardnadze's top commanders took a busload of troops to the north of the city where the Georgian defences were crumbling. At the front, General Ademia accused one officer of cowardice. Then the general led his men forward in a desperate attempt to throw back the Abkhazians, covering their push a Georgian anti-aircraft cannon. But the attack broke down under a hail of shell fire that had us diving for cover. As the battle turned against the Georgians, buses came for the wounded. Screaming in agony, soldiers were dragged on board. ITN cameraman John Steele bandaged a Georgian soldier. At the hospital, a stream of casualties, a message to the city that the counterattack had failed. With many of his soldiers openly panicking, it's only Shevardnadze's presence here, his strength of will, his encouragement to his own soldiers that is keeping the city in Georgian hands. But right now, not even he would be able to say how much longer they will be able to hold out. Back at the airport, despair was turning to anger. Soldiers pleaded with the pilot to let our crew on board. We got on, but as the crew struggled to shut the doors for takeoff, news came through that another aircraft trying to land had been shot down. Then, after the Georgians had warned the crowd to scatter, the sound of incoming shells. Later that night, our pilot decided to make a run for it with his lights out. A few minutes later, the plane was in the air packed with its cargo of wounded, but 2 of them died on the short flight to safety. Tonight, the airport is closed and Sukhumi is cut off. Julian Mannion, News at 10, on what may well have been the last flight out of Sukhumi.
While the eyes of the world have been fixed on events in Russia, to the south, a civil war in Georgia has become increasingly savage. Today, a number of refugees trying to flee the fighting in the city of Sukhumi were wounded when the airliner they were boarding was hit by an artillery shell. Abkhazian separatist rebels are besieging Sukhumi, which is the regional capital. All the roads are blocked and the only way in or out of the city is by air. Since the rebels broke a ceasefire last week, around 250 people have been killed. Sukhumi is the government's last stronghold in Abkhazia, and it's vowed to fight to the end. The residents of the city are desperate to leave. In ever greater numbers, they've been flocking to the airport to try and board one of the planes that ferry the wounded out of the war zone. But the rebels have shown no mercy. They've been targeting aircraft with increasing accuracy. In the past few days, they've attacked 3 planes, inflicting heavy loss of life and injuring dozens of civilians. Well, joining me now to discuss these events, as well as the latest from Moscow, is Professor Peter Frank of Essex University. Peter, Georgia is fast, it seems, beginning to ignore the value of human life, as has occurred in Bosnia. How bad is it?
It's very serious indeed. Civil war is always a very dirty, cruel, awful business. War, of course, by definition is, but civil war always tends to be more cruel. And if there are dimensions of nationality and ethnicity, as there are in this part of the Caucasus, then it tends to be even worse. The problem, I think, is that even when this business in Sukhumi, Abkhazia, is resolved in some kind of military sense, there are still so many tensions festering in Georgia that the chances of it continuing and widening a kind of belt of instability across the entire country is actually quite great.
Now, to Mr. Yeltsin's problems, at least still bloodless, thankfully, in Moscow, he seems to be well planned for all this.
Yes, he seems to be well prepared. At least on the surface, he's going about things methodically. He's going about them quite tactfully. And in general, things seem to be going very well for him. I think, however, that even if he wins this particular struggle with the Parliament, and it's looking as if he will, that is just the beginning of a long and very complex business which will have to try to confront the many crises which are at the moment getting worse inside Russia. But that, I think, is a necessary precondition that he should solve it.
Parliamentary elections in December, presidential in June. Will Yeltsin have to bring the June elections forward?
He certainly doesn't want to, and he said today that what he fears is what he calls bezvlastya, a kind of power vacuum, and there's a lot in what he says. But he may be forced to do so, particularly if the regional leaders exert pressure on him to do that.
And what do you make of Rutskoy?
Rutskoy says that he's not going to stand in the next election. Whether he will or not remains to be seen. My instinct is that he will want to, but clearly he wants to see what the outcome of the present struggle is going to be.
And today's statement of wanting to keep the calm.
Yes, today's statement, I think, is he really wants to recast himself once more as a positive figure, because I think he's become very tainted and tarnished over the last few days.
Peter Frank, thank you very much for joining us.
The Georgian President Edvard Shevardnadze is in hiding tonight after the fall of the Black Sea port of Sukhumi to Abkhazian separatists. He'd personally led the city's defense. Mr. Shevardnadze said he and Sukhumi had been let down by Russia and betrayed by his Georgian political opponents. He said hundreds had been killed in Sukhumi, a city tonight in flames. Our Moscow correspondent Julian Mannion sent us this report.
An Abkhazian tank rumbles into the center of devastated Sukhumi, the first dramatic pictures of how the rebel troops took the city from the Georgian army only a few hours ago. The imposing Council of Ministers building, which had served as the Georgian headquarters, burns fiercely, apparently after a savage exchange of fire with its defenders. The Georgian leader, the former Soviet Foreign Minister Edvard Shevardnadze, had his war room on the 9th floor of this building. Earlier today, Shevardnadze fled, shortly before the building was surrounded and blasted with heavy fire. And still wiping out pockets of Georgian resistance, the troops that have won this war. The army of the Abkhazian people, who now appear to have succeeded in their ambition to found yet another fledgling state on the ruins of the former Soviet Union. There are only 100,000 ethnic Abkhazians, and the Georgians have alleged that they could not have had such success without the assistance of parts of the Russian army. But little of that matters now. The Abkhazians have won the principal battle and perhaps the war. And tonight the fear is for how the victors will treat the Georgian civilians left behind in the rout. And beyond that, for the future of the Georgian nation itself. Shevardnadze, who had staked all on holding Sukhumi, is now a beaten and perhaps discredited figure. Tonight it is difficult to see how we will be able to prevent the Georgian heartland from being torn apart by dissension and civil strife in the aftermath of this shattering defeat. Julian Mannion, ITN, Moscow.
Government forces in Georgia have recaptured one of their strategic towns in the west of the republic. It was seized by rebels only last weekend. There was little resistance and government troops moved into Samtredia. The retaking of the town followed 3 days of troop and artillery movement. ITN's Julian Mannion has sent us this report from Georgia.
Georgian soldiers loyal to Edvard Shevardnadze are fighting to retake a string of towns which fell to rebels in the last week. This morning, a ragtag collection of soldiers began their assault on the town of Samtredia. Leading the advance, a homemade cannon made from a pair of helicopter rocket launchers mounted on a truck. Following behind, the armed mob that is the Georgian army. Still smarting from their defeat by the Abkhazians at Sukhumi, they are now fighting to prevent the rebel leader and former elected president Zviad Gamsakhurdia from taking control of the west of the country. The strategy was simple. Push up the main road into town while a few Georgian army tanks advance from the other side. The rebels seemed to melt away until snipers struck at the lead vehicles in the convoy. 3 soldiers died in a hail of bullets, and a survivor from the same car yelled hysterically. But within an hour, Shevardnadze's men were masters of the almost empty town. One of the army's warlords arrived in triumph, and the threat of a rebel advance on the Georgian capital appears to be over. Shevardnadze's men have halted the threat to Tbilisi and driven the enemy back. But the sad truth is that they appear no more effective in victory than they did in defeat. And in this part of Georgia at least, the country still seems in grave danger of sliding into anarchy and chaos. Julian Mannion, News at 10 in Samtredia.